You don't fear being alone, you fear being needed, not emotionally, neurologically. Maybe you take hours to reply to a message, even when you care. Maybe you feel relief when someone cancels plans. Maybe the moment someone starts depending on you, something inside you pulls back, not dramatically, just slightly. And you tell yourself, it's normal. Independence, boundaries, standards. But what most people call strength is often just survival. At some point, your brain made a quiet decision. Depending on people increased pain, so it rewrote the rules. Maybe you were 12, trying to stay calm while the adults around you were unstable. Maybe emotions weren't handled. They were ignored, minimized, or punished. Maybe every time you showed need, it created more chaos instead of comfort, so your nervous system adapted. It formed a silent law: I will never need anyone again. And it worked. You became efficient, self-contained, unshakable. You handled stress alone. You didn't beg for reassurance. You didn't fall apart when people left. From the outside, this looks powerful. But here's where the cost begins. When someone starts getting close, your mind doesn't register connection. It registers risk. They open up emotionally, you feel pressure. They ask for reassurance, you feel cornered. They want depth, you feel responsible. And something subtle happens. You start taking longer to reply. You become slightly harder to reach. You create space you can't fully explain. Not because you don't care, but because caring threatens the system that keeps you stable. And over time, this quiet habit begins to destroy connection. Because love does not enter systems built only for survival. Love requires exposure. Exposure feels like loss of control. So you stay composed, logical, grounded. But relationships start to feel heavy, not because you're incapable of love, but because your nervous system was trained to eliminate dependence. You didn't build independence to be free, you built it so no one could destabilize you again. And that's the conflict you never say out loud. It's not heartbreak you fear. It's this: if I let someone matter, I lose control. And control has kept you safe for a long time. But it might also be the reason love never fully stays. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone look at you and say, "Why don't you just tell me how you feel?" And in that moment, you freeze, not because you don't feel anything, but because translating it feels unnatural, heavy, exposing. You search for the right sentence, but nothing sounds safe enough, so you default to logic. I'm fine. It's not a big deal. You're overthinking it. You stabilize the situation, yet something inside them shuts down. You've probably heard it before. You're hard to read. You never open up. It feels like you don't need anyone. And you don't argue, because a part of you knows it's true. When someone starts getting emotionally close, it feels good at first. You like their presence, the connection, being chosen. But the moment they lean in more, something shifts. They text more often, want reassurance, ask where this is going, want depth, and instead of feeling closer, you feel pressure. You notice flaws, how they overthink, how they need comfort, how they want to talk about feelings again, and a quiet voice whispers, "This is too much." Here's the part that stings. Sometimes you lose respect for people the moment they become emotionally dependent, not because they did anything wrong, but because your nervous system associates need with weakness, and weakness feels unsafe. You don't want weak people, but strong people don't stay. That's the paradox. Strong people expect emotional exchange, reciprocity, access, and when they don't receive it, they slowly detach. You don't explode during conflict, you disappear. You call it needing space. They call it abandonment. And sometimes, late at night, when another connection fades, you wonder something you never say out loud: what is wrong with me? Why does closeness feel suffocating? Why does independence feel safer than intimacy? You tell yourself you just haven't met the right person, but the deeper truth is harder to face. The right person won't feel easy. They will feel threatening, because they will want access, and access activates the very system you built to survive. So you stay composed, capable, in control, and love keeps feeling like something you can manage, but never fully enter. Hyperindependence isn't a personality trait, it's nervous system conditioning. It forms when emotional reliance becomes unsafe, when comfort doesn't come, when help has consequences, and when vulnerability leads to instability instead of support. So your system adapts, not with philosophy, but with wiring. It learns a rule without words: dependence increases risk. And once that rule is installed, your behavior starts making sense. After a deep conversation with someone, you suddenly need distance. After intimacy, you feel overstimulated instead of closer. After someone opens up and says, "I really care about you," your chest tightens instead of softening. You ignore a call, delay replying, and tell yourself you're just busy. But deep down, you know it's something else. You tell yourself you just need space, but if you're honest, it's fear. Not fear of them, fear of exposure. Your nervous system reads closeness as unpredictability, and unpredictability once meant chaos. So you regulate. You minimize your needs, pride yourself on not asking for much, and process pain alone. When you're overwhelmed, you don't reach out, you isolate. When you're hurt, you don't say it, you detach. When someone tries to comfort you, you feel irritated instead of relieved, not because you don't want love, but because relying on someone feels like handing them a weapon. Here's the illusion. You think you're protecting yourself from abandonment, but what you're actually doing is pre-abandoning. You leave emotionally before anyone can leave physically, creating distance before they can destabilize you. And it shows up in patterns: warm one week, distant the next, intense connection, then sudden coolness. Not manipulation, regulation. You overthink after emotional closeness. Did I say too much? Am I getting too attached? This is moving too fast. And instead of leaning in, you lean back, because stability feels safer than intimacy. The problem is, stability alone cannot sustain connection. Relationships don't run on competence, they run on emotional availability. And your system was trained to treat availability as a threat. That's why people say you're distant, not because you lack depth, but because depth activates your defenses. You didn't choose this armor, it formed when you needed it. But now it blocks the very thing you want. Systems built to prevent pain don't discriminate, they block danger and intimacy with the same wall. Hyperindependence creates a specific kind of power: emotional silence. You don't beg, you don't chase, you don't collapse under pressure. In social dynamics, that reads as strength, composure, control. But inside relationships, that same silence creates distortion. When someone expresses emotion, and you respond with logic, you feel stable. They feel unheard. When someone seeks reassurance, and you respond with independence, you feel grounded. They feel unnecessary. When conflict appears, and you withdraw to regulate, you feel safe. They feel abandoned. It's not that either of you is wrong, you're just operating in different currencies. You operate in control, they operate in connection. Like two people trying to dance to different music, you moving precisely, carefully, measured, they moving emotionally, responsively, fluid. Neither rhythm is broken, but they don't synchronize. At first, the misalignment is subtle. They bring something vulnerable, you neutralize it. They bring something emotional, you stabilize it. You believe you're helping, they experience distance. Slowly, both start to feel unseen, you misunderstood, they unmet. That's the erosion, not dramatic fights, not explosive endings, just quiet reduction. Emotional bids decrease. They stop sharing small things, stop asking deeper questions, stop leaning. Not because they stopped caring, but because the system doesn't reward emotional risk. Connection adjusts based on feedback, and when emotional expression meets neutrality instead of responsiveness, expression reduces. You don't intend this, you're not trying to control anyone, you're trying to stay regulated. But regulation without responsiveness creates isolation. Here's the deeper mechanism. You associate emotional exposure with loss of power, so silence feels strong, logic feels safe, and composure feels superior to vulnerability. Yet silence also removes access, and unreachable people don't get deeply loved. They get admired, respected, sometimes even desired, but not fully known. The paradox is brutal. The very control that protects your autonomy slowly weakens your intimacy. Not because you lack emotion, but because emotion inside you has no exit. You trained yourself to survive without needing, and now someone is asking you to connect without controlling, and that feels destabilizing. So you stay steady. They grow tired, and neither fully understands why the distance keeps increasing. Two people, two good intentions, different music, and no one leading the same dance. Healing hyper-independence does not mean becoming dependent. It means becoming responsive instead of defensive. That shift is microscopic, starting in moments most people never notice. When someone asks how you're doing, instead of saying I'm good, you pause, check in, and answer honestly, even if the honesty is small. When you feel the urge to withdraw after closeness, you don't force yourself to stay open forever, you just don't disappear. You return the call, send the message, say, I just needed a moment. That simple act alone can change a dynamic, and yet, you will still want to run. Your body may feel exposed after vulnerability, your mind may rehearse detachment, you may feel irritated by someone needing you, but that doesn't mean you're failing. It means your nervous system is recalibrating, learning that connection can be safe, even when independence once equaled it. The real work is not becoming more emotional, it's tolerating emotional presence, without shutting down. Letting someone see you without immediately correcting the image. Saying, that hurt, instead of pretending it didn't. Admitting, I don't know, instead of defaulting to competence. You don't lose strength in this process, you redefine it. Strength is no longer the ability to need no one, it becomes the ability to stay when you want to leave, to communicate when silence would be easier, to allow support without feeling smaller. That's power with flexibility, and flexibility sustains connection. It requires repetition, courage, and patience, but each small choice shifts the patterns that hyper-independence built over years. The goal isn't to dismantle your independence. You keep your resilience, composure, and self-reliance, but you add accessibility, expression, and presence. Gradually, conversations deepen instead of stall, conflicts resolve instead of freeze, and closeness stops feeling like a threat and begins to feel like expansion, not because fear vanished, but because you stopped obeying it automatically. Healing hyperindependence isn't about becoming softer, it's about becoming secure enough to stay open. And that, in turn, changes everything. At some point, you begin to notice it, the pattern, the almost relationships, the slow fade after intensity, the way things feel powerful at the start, then quietly collapse. And part of you says, they just weren't right, but another part knows the truth. Something inside you pulls away first. You don't explode. You don't sabotage dramatically. You just reduce. You text less. You take longer to reply, even when you saw it immediately. You convince yourself you're just busy. You feel relief when plans get canceled. You call it peace. But if you're honest, it's distance. And distance has always felt like control. The shift begins with conscious choice. The goal is not to become more available to everyone, but to become consciously available to the right people. That requires something terrifying: staying. Staying in the conversation when it gets vulnerable. Staying present when someone expresses disappointment. Staying connected after intimacy, instead of emotionally evacuating. You will feel the urge to create space. You will hear the internal voice. This is too much. I need to rebalance. They're expecting something. That voice once protected you, but now it limits you. Transformation happens not when fear disappears, but when you act differently while fear is present. You send the message anyway. You say, that actually scared me, instead of pretending it didn't. You admit you care. You stop performing indifference, because indifference is armor, and armor blocks impact both ways. Here is the truth most people never realize: hyper-independence does not attract secure love. It attracts people who either chase distance or eventually grow tired of it. Secure love requires visibility, and visibility feels like risk, but risk is the entry fee to intimacy. The strongest people are not those who never need anyone, they are the ones who can be loved without losing themselves. That is power. Not isolation. Not emotional silence. Not being low maintenance. Being fully yourself, and still connected. You don't have to become softer. You don't have to become clingy. You don't have to abandon your independence. You just stop using it as a shield, and when you do, something surprising happens. You don't lose respect, you gain depth. You don't lose control, you gain connection. You don't become weaker, you become secure. Secure people don't fear closeness, they choose it. If this made you see yourself differently, stay. This is only the beginning. There's more beneath this pattern, and once you understand it, you don't just improve relationships, you change how you show up in every part of your life. If this resonated, it's not by accident. You're not here for motivation. You're here to understand power, control, and the hidden rules of human behavior. The knowledge in this channel isn't for everyone, it's for those who want clarity over comfort, mastery over chaos, and insight that others ignore. If you want more of this kind of analysis, the kind that sharpens your mind and gives you leverage in relationships, work, and life, subscribe quietly. Turn on notifications. Watch closely, because the more you understand the psychology around you, the more you control the space between yourself and everyone else.